published this last fall by Verso Books, and it's called Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. And it's not what he's covering in the lecture tonight, but it certainly is the long background to the position that he's taken. In fact, Norman, if this book had been available last September, it's the text I've been looking for a long time on dealing with the history of the conflict. And I can say that in a way just by reading briefly to you from another major one of the new historians on the history of the conflict, Avishtaim of St. Anthony's College in Oxford, writes on this book that Norman Finkelstein is one of the most radical and hard-hitting critics of the official Zionist version of the Arab-Israeli conflict and of the historians who support this version. In this book, he launches a frontal attack not just on Zionist thinking, but on Israel's policy toward the Arabs since 1948. His work is scholarly, incisive, and highly original, but the quality that makes it stand out is its intellectual integrity. The book makes a major contribution to the study of the Arab-Israeli conflict and deserves to be widely read, especially in the United States. And I could add to Avishtaim and in Canada, because one is dealing with a very similar environment on the understanding of this conflict. He deals very effectively in this book, and I push it a bit more. You can see we have some signing ceremonies. The book is nicely for sale in the Carleton University bookstore, and it's also at Prospero and Octopus, where he's signing tomorrow at 12 at Prospero and at 3 o'clock at Octopus on Bank Street. What Chapter 1 does is make available something that hasn't been well known outside of the doctoral dissertation at Princeton, which he wrote on Zionist ideology, where all of the trouble that he got into began on dealing with something that he came at rather tangentially from someone who was really a political philosopher, and was dealing with deep questions of philosophy and ideology associated with 19th century thinking and how it was translated into the events that we're all so much more familiar with the latter part of the 20th century. The second chapter repeats something that also is not widely known, although parts previously published, and that is the extraordinary expose which he wrote on a book which sold millions of copies in 1984 about the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict, arguing, this is Joan Peters' book from time immemorial, that argued that Arabs didn't live there but only moved in response to the growing success of Jewish colonists. Now, this book had 1,800 footnotes and supposedly represented an enormous piece of scholarship. And where many of us who spent longer in the trenches than Norman has on this should have recognized from the beginning the enormous expose that was needed to show the fraudulent nature of this book at a time it was being highly touted by some of the leading scholars in the United States. To this day, I can sit here with the Ottawa Citizen and the Toronto Globe and Mail wrote rave reviews of a book which, thanks to Norman, was first exposed as a complete fraud, undoubtedly, in my own view, written in Israel. Victor Ostrovsky, whom some of you also know of local Ottawa fame, in fact told Norman later that he participated in the Mossad project in which this book was written to overcome negative publicity in the United States about Israel's invasion of Lebanon. And that's really what lay behind it. Now, mind you, someone who sets up himself as an expose of this kind of massive fraud is going to get in trouble, which has been much of the story of all of us who've slipped in sideways to this conflict over the years. The chapters 3 and 4 deal with the very important group of new Israeli historians who have now had access, first of all, to the Israeli Defense Force records, and not dealt with so much in this book, but we have at least one who didn't intend to be a new historian, but has ended up being one, Itamar Rabinovich, who used to be a professor at the Norman Patterson School at Carleton University, has had access for the first time to the Israeli Foreign Office records, where he showed that every single Arab government held secret negotiations with Israel from 1948 to 1952. All were willing to recognize the state of Israel if something were done about the Palestinian refugees. And so the whole kind of myths on the beginning are now becoming much clearer. Things that were always argued on the Arab side, but without that full documentation, that is now coming from the scholarly community. He picks up very much, of course, after that whole debate on 1948 in this book, with a really hard-hitting chapter on the origins and consequences of the 1967 war, which is another one of these great mythical ones that you'll see references to all the time. I just had to write to one of the online encyclopedias, which talked in their newest version that you can now get on cyberspace of when the Arabs invaded Israel in 1967. These kinds of things very much get repeated over and over again unless challenged. And then there is a chapter as well in 1973, and this book closes with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Tonight, he's dealing with an assessment of the Oslo Accords. We're in a deep period of only the deepest concern right now. All of you are following the events more closely even than I on cyberspace about the depth of the suffering which is now taking place as a result of the closure, which is likely to continue right to the end of the Israeli election. So he comes to us with a fresh insights on, I think, one of the most difficult times we've gone through in a long period. And so I'm particularly pleased to have a chance to welcome someone whom I so greatly admire as Norman Finkelstein.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's always a pleasure to come to Canada and to this university. I very much doubt in the U.S. you would get an audience of this size any longer to discuss the events in Israel-Palestine, mostly because the assumption is, and there's certainly grounds for the assumption, that Israel has effectively won, and there's a kind of quiet jubilation, and therefore the forces of, so to speak, evil don't feel obliged any longer to turn out for events. They're just quietly rubbing their hands in glee. What I wanted to discuss this evening is the present status of the conflict, in particular the Oslo Accords, more especially the Oslo II Accord, the one that was signed September 28, 1995. I guess I should begin by putting in some sort of context relevant to the most recent turn of events, and I refer here not to the closure, though I'll come back to that towards the end, but rather with the suicide bombings. Nobody, I think, would want to search for any extenuation of the suicide bombings which targeted, obviously and without, as I say, any mitigating circumstances, targeted civilians, and is totally deplorable. On the other hand, it seems to me the way the media is portraying the event is fundamentally false in at least one crucial respect, and that is the media is claiming, and scholarship as well is claiming, that these suicide bombers had sabotaged or were attempting to sabotage a peace process. Now that, it seems to me, is flat out false. There isn't a scratch of evidence to prove, no documentary evidence certainly, to prove that what's unfolding now in Israel-Palestine is a peace process. What's effectively unfolding is a defeat process. Israel is now in the process of completing its conquest of mandatory Palestine, and as its juggernaut proceeds across the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinians, many gripped by despair and despondency, are engaging in actions which, however deplorable, it seems to me, are at least to some extent predictable and inevitable. As Professor Said writes in his most recent book, Peace and Its Discontents, probably the most remarkable fact about the reaction of Palestinians to their systematic humiliation, degradation, and dispossession, probably the most remarkable fact is how little violence and, in effect, terrorism it's evoked and elicited. Now, as we're entering the terminal phase of Israel's conquest, it's obviously eliciting and evoking more violence, deplorable, but as I said, it seems to me at any rate, pretty much predictable. It's people refusing to go to their graves alone. Obviously, it's wrong to want to take others with you. On the other hand, it seems to me reasonably understandable that some do not wish to go to their graves peacefully. Well, having said that, I think my next task is obviously to try to prove that claim, that there isn't a peace process unfolding, but factually there is a defeat process on the Palestinian side and a victory process on the Israeli side. There have thus far been published 3, in my opinion, useful and insightful critiques of the Oslo, I won't use the terms peace process because I find it so offensive, even in quotes, so let's just call it the Oslo process. There have been 3 useful critiques published, in my opinion. One by the Israeli former vice mayor of Jerusalem, Meron Ben-Venisti, his remarkably candid, in my view, accurate book, Intimate Enemies. 2, Professor Chomsky's contributions, most substantively the last chapter of his book, World Orders Old and New. He's written other articles since, but the basic framework is laid out in the 3rd chapter of that book. And 3, most recently, this one written not by an Israeli and not by an American, but by a Palestinian. It's Edward Said's Honorable Dissent, Peace and Its Discontents. None of the 3 books, however, were published, were able to take into account the Oslo II Accord. They all basically refer to Oslo I, the September 1993 Accord. I will try to focus in these remarks on Oslo II, because the fact of the matter is, from here on in, that's what we'll be dealing with. Oslo II is the practical implementation of Oslo I. Oslo I was the global framework, the principles as they were called. Oslo II is the blueprint, and it's a hefty document. It runs to over 300 folio-sized pages. It's remarkably detailed in some respects and remarkably vague in other respects, a topic I'll also return to. The reigning wisdom on Oslo II, I'll just quote to you from the most recent issue of the New York Review of Books. Amos Oz, the dovish Israeli writer, condemning the Hamas suicide bombings, he stated as follows: "There are hundreds of clauses and subclauses to the Oslo Accords, but the essence is clear and simple. We stop ruling over you and suppressing you, and you recognize Israel and stop killing us. But up until now, we have delivered and you haven't." So that's pretty much the reigning wisdom. You'll find no challenges in the full spectrum of opinion, either in the United States or I suspect Canada as well. now that there are Palestinians who can lend their credentials to filling out the spectrum and saying the right things, speaking the party line, they no longer have any use for dissenting voices. They can always call up the local PLO to supply some hack to say the right things and get his check at the end of the week. So the point of view that will be presented here is not, I think, available anywhere in the mainstream media. I'll use as my guide Professor Said's book, but I'll develop it, as I say, because Professor Said's book was not able to take into account the specific clauses of Oslo II. The essence of the September 1993 Oslo Agreement, we'll call it Oslo I, according to Said, was that it gave Palestinians consent to continued occupation. Indeed, the PLO agreed to serve, in Professor Said's words, as Israel's enforcer. A close reading of the September 1995 Oslo II agreement only reinforces Said's case. Up until the Oslo Accords, an international consensus basically existed on how to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. Essentially, it said that Israel was, under international law, compelled to withdraw from all of the West Bank and Gaza, and Palestinians would be able to exercise their rights of self-determination within the area that Israel evacuated. The PLO accepted those terms. Israel and the United States did not. Turning to Oslo II, it reads, "Neither party shall be deemed, by virtue of having entered into this agreement, to have renounced or waived any of its existing rights, claims, or positions." On the surface, that seems like a perfectly balanced article in Oslo II. Neither party has to give up its rights, its claims, or positions. The problem is, up until Oslo I, the universal consensus was that Israel had no rights in the West Bank and Gaza. The Oslo Accord now grants a legitimacy to their claim that they have rights. Similarly, up until Oslo I, the universal consensus was that Israel had to renounce its claims and its positions on the West Bank and Gaza. After Oslo I and II, Israel's claims and positions are now granted a legitimacy. The West Bank and Gaza, Said writes, have now become, once they were occupied territories, now they have become disputed territories. Thus, with Palestinian assistance, Israel has been awarded at least an equal claim to them. In other words, once beyond dispute, Israel's withdrawal will now be subject to the give and take of what are called permanent status negotiations. With Palestinians on the one side and Israel and the United States on the other, not too much imagination is needed to predict who will give and who will take. On all crucial issues, Jerusalem, water, reparations, sovereignty, security, land, Palestinians, according to Said, have in effect gained nothing. Indeed, looking closely at Oslo II, one discovers that the picture is rather bleaker than Said suggests. I want to go over carefully those issues because they're the heart of the Accord and really the heart of the conflict. Let's start with Jerusalem. Amid an analysis of Jerusalem as the nexus or the core of Israel's conquest strategy, Said observes that in the history of colonial invasion, maps are instruments of conquest. Now, will you be able to hear me in the back if I refer to the map? Can you hear me? Good. I want to refer to the map of Oslo II. If you look at the text of Oslo II, it states that Jerusalem will be left for final or permanent status negotiations. Turning to the official map of Oslo II, the one to which the PLO lent its signature, we discover the following. This area here, in a kind of pale brown interspersed with a white, this is Israel on the map. If you look at Jerusalem, this is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now part of Israel. I'll return later to what's called areas A, B, and C. Areas A, B, and C are the areas in which the West Bank was divided according to the Oslo Accord. The notable fact for our purposes is Jerusalem is not in Area A, it's not in Area B, and it's not in Area C. Jerusalem is part of Israel. Looking at the map, Jerusalem is a closed issue. It's no longer part of the permanent status negotiations. To judge by the map, Israel has already annexed Jerusalem. Another aspect of the map. This is Israel. This is the West Bank. How do you know where Israel ends and where the West Bank begins? I sat poring over the map for several days trying to figure that out until it dawned on me that's the whole point. Israel has erased the line separating Israel proper, or pre-67 Israel, from the West Bank. The West Bank has already been annexed. There is no longer what's called in the literature the Green Line. The Green Line is where hostilities suspended at the end of the June 1967 war. The Green Line, the dividing line, the border between the West Bank and Israel, has been effaced on the official map. Israel, if you look at the official map, is no longer an occupying power. The area from the Mediterranean to the Jordan is now a unitary entity. Number 3, if you look at the text of the agreement, it says that the territorial integrity of the West Bank as a single entity has been maintained. The territorial integrity of the West Bank as a single entity has been maintained. Now look at the map. This represents one kind of control, the areas in yellow. The areas in brown represent a second kind of control. The areas in white represent a third kind of control. In other words, the yellow and brown blotches awash in a sea of white. The Sea of White, incidentally, is the area of Israeli sovereignty, according to Oslo II. The yellow and brown blotches awash in a sea of white. They just almost mockingly belie the textual claim that the West Bank is still a single entity. Its integrity has been maintained. Looking at the map, all told, what do you get? What you get is what Israel has always wanted. The claim is that Mr. Rabin and the Labor Party generally overnight became peaceniks. Well, what does the map show you? The map shows you that since the late 1960s, the Labor Party has been trying to implement what it calls the Alone Plan. The Alone Plan called for incorporating about half of the West Bank into Israel, consigning the areas of what are called dense Arab settlement to some kind of Palestinian self-rule, taking Jerusalem, well, you can continue, but the point is quite obvious. Looking at the map, what you get is an extreme version of the Allon plan.